Coming up today on Seahawks Forever, powered by BetUS, it is Roster Palooza time. I'll give you my reaction to some of the surprises of the initial roster set yesterday by the Seahawks, and then catch you up on what's happening today. The Seahawks lose a couple of players to waivers. They don't gain any, and now they're starting to fill out their practice squad. Lots of interesting decisions by the Seahawks. I'll give you my thoughts coming up next on Seahawks Forever.
Welcome to the Seahawks Forever podcast. In-depth analysis on everything Seahawks. And now, here's your host, Dan Viens.
All the different ways you can support the channel and the show will be linked down below in the description on YouTube. But of course, the best way is to subscribe to the YouTube channel. Hit that thumbs up for this video if you like what you see, and that bell button will give you notification of all future episodes. And if you prefer audio, Seahawks Forever is available on all the platforms. Be sure to subscribe there. And if you like what you hear, leave a rating or a review. And also down below, if you want to check out BetUS, sign up for an account today. They'll give you a 125% sign-up bonus on your first 3 deposits up to $2,000. Lots going on. Didn't have a chance to react after the rosters were set yesterday, but I don't know. I think this morning is a little bit more fun. There's a lot going on around the league. First of all, there's a lot of overreaction that happens on roster cut down day, waiver claim day, as practice squads are filled out. Players flash and fans get attached to the upside and the potential of a player. And sometimes it's a little out of whack with reality. Also keep in mind, I've been talking about this for the last couple of weeks, that a lot of these decisions on the initial roster, and again, that is the key word. This is the initial roster. It is not the final roster. Many rosters around the league, the Seahawks potentially included, are going to look a lot different a week from now than they do today. And some of the moves made yesterday are strategic. It's not necessarily the Seahawks making a statement that this is our best 53, but they have to be calculated in those moves. Which are the players, especially when we're talking about young developmental players that aren't going to start day one, but the Seahawks really like and want to be part of the future, or at least want to give them a shot at developing into being a part of the future. And you have to weigh the risks and benefits of keeping a player and potentially risking him to waivers. For example, if we just go back yesterday and look at some of the cuts, George Holani at running back, the Seahawks' decision to only keep 3 running backs. A few weeks ago, it looked like Holani had pulled ahead of Kenny McIntosh. And then in the last week and a half, it seemed pretty clear based on a bunch of things. I think my first clue that McIntosh was still ahead of Holani on the depth chart, even though the Seahawks had some concerns about McIntosh's pass protection skills compared to Holani. That's a real strength of his. Was when they had the joint practices in Tennessee, Holani was getting some run ahead of McIntosh in the offensive portion, but when it came time to do 2-minute drill, red zone stuff, more specialized scenarios and situations, McIntosh was ahead. And then you saw how dynamic he was. The Seahawks' best runner in the preseason overall, averaged over 5 yards a carry, looked explosive, decisive, physical, running between the tackles. Certainly in a vacuum, Holani had a good preseason too, but I think McIntosh was more consistent overall. And then we saw the big touchdown run on Saturday to kind of cap it. He can also help in the return game a little bit, but the decision to keep 3 running backs was not because they didn't think Holani was good enough or they didn't like him. They did. But running backs typically don't get claimed. If a team is going to carry a young running back on the practice squad, it makes more sense to keep a guy that's been in camp with you and is ready to go and understands your offense, and you don't have to worry about getting him up to speed. No news as I speak at this moment on Holani signing with the Seahawks. He may have some interest around the league. Remember, once players pass through waivers, and that waiver deadline was this morning, it's a free-for-all. It's a whole new wave of free agency after claims are sorted out. Helani was a guy that the only reason, it was pretty widely understood, the only reason he wasn't drafted was there were some injury concerns at Boise State. Otherwise, I think he was a day 3 draftable player. And so there may be teams that around there that had a 5th, 6th, 7th round grade on Helani and have seen what he did in the preseason with the Seahawks, having, first of all, a healthy preseason and also a productive one. He may have some other suitors, and they can offer a little bit more as far as bonuses go and things like that, or promises to elevate on game day. Those are things that can be done as well. And so we'll see. Maybe by the time I'm done recording this, within the next half hour or so, he'll have signed with the Seahawks or someone else. So that was one of the surprises. The biggest surprise for me, the biggest thing that stuck out, and I kind of half jokingly tweeted about it a couple of days ago, or yesterday, as some of the cuts were leaking out in advance of the 1 o'clock deadline on the Pacific Coast. I tweeted, are the Seahawks just going to keep 12 offensive linemen? Because none of those names were leaking out. They kept 11. And if you count Abe Lucas, who will start the season on the PUP list, no surprise there, that is 12. And this is what I'm talking about as far as being strategic. And this is my favorite part of what they did in putting this roster together, is after 15 years, and you can argue going back even further than that, the Seahawks have struggled to develop a young, cohesive offensive line that's a strength of the team. And they've paid for it at times, especially over the last couple of years. You could argue that even as bad as the defense was, the offensive line not being good enough to run the football, sustain drives, also kind of kept their ceiling at 9 wins. But the commitment this time to young offensive linemen, to keep Michael Jarrell, their 6th-round pick, to keep Stal Lemea, their 5th-round pick, as well as one of my under-the-radar favorites ever since he signed right at the beginning of training camp, Jalen Sundell, although his situation might be a little bit different, tells me 2 things. One is they really are committed once and for all to developing young offensive linemen, to building that unit out long-term instead of just throwing darts at a board and patching it together every year and hoping they can make it work. Committing to guys they think have tremendous upside. The other part of that equation is, I think when you look at those 3 in particular they kept, there is a preference now for more athletic linemen. That the upside of a Michael Jarrell, who is, for his size, tremendous athlete, top 5-6 percentile. Lemea, also a guy that may have had his ups and downs through camp, but what I saw in the second half against Cleveland was a guy that can get to the second level really, really well, and some things seemed to click for him on Saturday night. And I thought he looked really good in the second half. And then Sundell was just kind of a revelation. He stood out to me, first of all, in the public practice at Lumen Field a few weeks ago, and he had only been on the roster for a couple of weeks. And I had kind of forgotten all about him, but he just stood out. He flashed. Who's that guy? I was sitting with Bryce Coots at the time, and we both thought the same thing. Very similar athletic profile to Connor Williams. Taller, longer, rangier, more athletic, more able to get to that second level, more able to pull and move. He just looked like a pro to me. He really looked in control. And there may be another aspect to keeping him, because the Seahawks aren't 100% sure that Connor Williams is going to be ready to go and 100% healthy by week 1. And so you have to have another option. If Sundell is going to have to be or if Williams is going to have to be ineligible or inactive week 1, then Olu Oluwatimi is your starter, presumably, and Sundell would be your backup. Now, it's a different conversation when Williams gets healthy. Do they just try to pass Sundell through waivers? Or is he a guy they like? And now does Olu Oluwatimi become available? Maybe you get a late round pick. Maybe you recoup the 5th that it took to draft him, because I do still think Oluwatimi has long-term starter upside in this league. He just doesn't fit every system, and he clearly doesn't seem to fit this system and what Ryan Grubb and Scott Huff want to do in the running game athletically from a profile standpoint like he did the previous regime. He's a guy that just doesn't move as well. He's not as twitchy, not as explosive. And so he might be available instead. And they might be looking at Connor Williams and Jalen Sundell being the long-term duo there. That would be my preference. I want the athletic upside. And the thing about Sundell is he was All-American last year at left tackle at North Dakota State University, Division II, whatever they're calling it nowadays, powerhouse. But for the 3 years before that, he started at center. So a very experienced center. It was a very easy transition for him to make to go back there. So that was another surprise, but a very, very pleasant one. Now, there is a thought that perhaps the Seahawks feel like because offensive linemen, especially ones with, upside and a high athletic ceiling, are a little hard to come by for some teams around the league, that getting those guys through waivers would have been harder at the cut down when teams are combing through and trying to find those gems. Then maybe if you do intend ultimately to try and get Jarrell or Lamea to the practice squad, might be better to do it early next week. Teams have already set their 53. And so they'd have to be willing to commit a 53-man spot to one of those guys to claim them when they've already gone through all the machinations to set their roster for now. So that'll be interesting to watch. But I think what they've done with the rest of the roster, I don't think they need to. I think they can hang on to those guys. And then, we're going to get into a much bigger conversation down the road. I think when you talk about athletic profile, Laken Tomlinson, certainly at his age, is a guy who's just on borrowed time. It's a one-year deal, obviously. But what if Christian Haynes at some point, who looked really good when they started giving him reps at left guard, if Anthony Bradford holds onto that spot at right guard, what if Christian Haynes ultimately proves that he needs to play and ahead of Tomlinson? Do you even need Laken Tomlinson on the roster? Do you make a move at that point? Or does Haynes ultimately prove that he belongs at right guard over Anthony Bradford, who doesn't really fit that athletic profile? He's done some good things this preseason. He can certainly move some bodies. But is he really the ideal profile that they're looking for as a guy that can get out and move to the second level either? So lots of storylines there moving forward. And then Abe Lucas, obviously on the PUP list, it's disappointing because heading into training camp, there were some reports that, Corbin Smith told us on this show that he'd been told that there was confidence within the building that Lucas was going to be ready to go week one. And then it kept getting pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. The latest we're hearing from Corbin, again, is that he's being told the Seahawks really don't think it's a career-threatening injury to Lucas, that it's been corrected, that the recovery just is taking longer than they'd like. And so, you know what? We've got George Fant. Let's keep him on that PUP list. It's a minimum of 4 games, but I think you can keep him on there for much, much longer than that. Let's wait until he's 100% healthy, even if it costs him this entire year. If there's a possibility that at some point you get Abe Lucas back and he's Abe Lucas, then it's worth being patient. One of the bigger surprises, though, of those 11 players they kept, McClendon Curtis not being one of them, is really interesting. Corbin had said he's a roster lock. I had said so too, because he could play basically every position except center. And while he had his struggles, especially in pass protection at tackle, more naturally at guard, I think they really liked him there. But ultimately, the decision to go with those other guys who I think do have a more refined skill set, a little bit more to work with, I thought said a lot. I'm not sure the previous coaching staff would have made this move, would have pounded the table for McClendon Curtis, is what I think they would have done, and maybe convinced Schneider that's the way to go. Because the way that they handled that position at this cut down date was so different than what we've seen in the past, tells you that John Schneider really listens to his coaches and does what they want, and that Scott Huff, Ryan Grubb, Mike McDonald, with how he wants to establish a run game and build a good offensive line, that their influence and their input into this decision had to carry a bunch of weight with Schneider. So really interesting to see. Elsewhere, I was a little surprised that DJ James was cut. I know some of you have been telling me he should be for the last couple of weeks. I just thought, a draft pick, that kind of upside, making the move to slot corner where he hadn't played a lot, that's a transition that takes a while. We saw that with Kobe Bryant. We've seen it with other guys, even going back to Justin Coleman. Like it's a different game in there. That surprised me a little bit, but he has cleared waivers. I haven't seen any report yet. I'll check again here before we wrap up today, but nothing yet. He may have some other opportunities that he's weighing around the league because he was a draftable player. And then inside linebacker, they released Michael Barrett, who they just acquired, trading Mike Jackson to Carolina for him. He played for Mike McDonald for a year at Michigan. Certainly Jay Harbaugh knows him. He's a scheme fit. He's everything. He was a draft pick, so you'd have the 4-year contract at a 7th round salary cap number. That was attractive. Barrett said when he got here, it felt like home. It's the scheme he's used to. He really likes being here. So I can only assume that they were confident he would pass through waivers, which he has. But again, nothing yet on him resigning here. I'd be shocked if he doesn't end up on the practice squad because of his comments the other day. Because the Seahawks went out and traded something for him, but also because of his comments of how this felt like home and this felt like, where he wanted to be. It was his favorite team growing up, Seattle Seahawks. So, or no, that was Travis Gibson, wasn't it, that said that the other day. And so I expect Barrett to be back. But the fact that Drake Thomas made it ahead of him, I find to be maybe the most fascinating decision here. Just because I didn't know if there was enough time. Thomas only returned to practice 2 weeks ago after missing almost a year because of a knee injury that we never got any clarification on. There's some speculation it was a patella tendon injury or an ACL. All we knew when he got hurt last year is it was a knee. But because he wasn't a marquee player, we didn't get a lot of digging. We didn't get a lot of reporting on what it might be. And I even asked Corbin a couple of weeks ago, what's the deal with Drake Thomas? And he said, I'm hearing nothing. He had, I have no idea. And then a week later, he's activated. He practices. He plays in the game on Saturday. Thomas is a guy that I really liked this time a year ago is when they acquired him in the waiver cutdown period where he had been set, or the Raiders waived him at the cutdown, tried to get him to the practice squad, and the Seahawks claimed him. And I know every time I talk about him, I mention this, but the video I did about how excited I was about Thomas and some of the things I saw on tape coming out of NC State for him is still, I think, the most viewed video in Seahawks Forever history to this point. So I'm a Drake Thomas fan. I just didn't know if he had a shot to make this roster under this coaching staff with what we saw from Patrick O'Connell yet again, another good preseason, with the longtime relationship they had with John Radigan, with Michael Barrett being acquired. And so I just wasn't sure. But then I was listening to Rob Rang last night, and does such a great job with draft prep and scouting. And he's got some tie-ins, and he talks to some of those guys in the building, and he says they just that the Seahawks are so high on Thomas's not just his ability and his upside when he's healthy, but also his brain, his ability to diagnose, and how instinctive he is. And so that's just one of those things that kind of flies under the radar because we hadn't heard that they were extremely high on him from the get-go, but none of us really knew that. And so that's why we didn't put him in our projections as we were trying to predict the 53-man roster. BetUS makes it really easy to bet on your favorite teams. This is what it looks like when you go to the NFL page. You scroll down to the Seahawks' first game on September 8th, the home opener at Lumen Field against the Denver Broncos. You can see the Seahawks, according to BetUS, a 5.5-point favorite at the moment. You click on markets here, and it'll bring you to the page, show you all the betting lines. The over-under right now set at 42, according to BetUS. Later in the week, the game props here will populate, and you can do prop bets to your liking. Just click on place my bets, choose the under if you want to, and place your bet. If you sign up now for BetUS, they will give you a 125% sign-up bonus on your first 3 deposits up to $2,000. You can click the link down below to set up your account now. They may have, but teams that were higher in the waiver order may have beat them to it. Also, news just coming in as I started this that D. Eskridge has signed with the Miami Dolphins to be on their practice squad. So that's interesting. So far, what we know about the practice squad for the Seahawks, Patrick O'Connell is back. Aesop Winston Jr. at wide receiver. Garrett Greenfield, another really interesting undrafted offensive lineman, can play guard and tackle out of South Dakota State. Was really hoping that he would make it. A couple of safeties. Ty Okada, of course. Nice to see that. And Marquise Blair, basically out of football last year, coming back, really showing some flashes of what we remember from Blair, the former second-round pick out of Utah, flying around, hitting guys, being physical. He's back on the practice squad. That's cool to see. And then a couple of defensive linemen for depth. This is a position we thought maybe the Seahawks would claim somebody, and they may still be looking, especially with Cameron Young being officially placed on the PUP list to start the season. Devere Levelston and Kion Bars. Bars was a late signee out of USC a couple weeks ago, and then Levelston, one of the original undrafted free agents. So those guys are back so far. Also, maybe the most interesting move they've made on the practice squad so far, bringing back Tyreek Smith. Tyreek Smith drafted in the 5th round in 2022 out of Ohio State. They really liked him as an outside linebacker, pass rusher type. And then he hurt his shoulder, missed all of his rookie year. Came back in the next offseason. We just kept hearing Carroll just kept talking about him, name dropping him, talking about how much they liked him. He flashed in the preseason, did some cool things. They waived him on the cut down, and the Arizona Cardinals claimed him. He spent all season on their practice squad. I can't remember if he was elevated at any time. But they cut him, and he comes back. And this tells me something, because as high as Carroll and his staff were on Smith, the fact that Mike McDonald, with his defensive track record, and Adam Durde and all the guys on that side of the ball, also liked Smith enough to bring him back, it's pretty cool. Tells me something, because there is still, a little bit, it's nice to have that one extra edge depth piece there, even though they bring Gibson in, because we don't know about Uchenna Nwosu's injury status. That was a cool move. I like seeing that. Now, have to talk about the fact that Nwosu was not placed on injured reserve. Tells me that for now, at least, the Seahawks are confident that he could be back sooner rather than later, closer to that 2-week mark than that 6-week mark, sprained MCL. That they at least feel good enough for now to see how his rehab goes over the next week or two. Can still add him to IR with the designation to return at any time over the next week or two. But haven't done that, and that tells me that maybe we get him back sooner rather than later. And, Nwosu himself going on Twitter and saying BRB the other day. So maybe we'll see Nwosu soon. The other interesting question was, what were they going to do at wide receiver? That 6th spot, the first 5 were set in stone. They end up going with Tariq Young over Cody White, who I would hope to be signed back to the practice squad. They've already brought Aesop Winston Jr. back. Winston was another guy that was in contention for that. Eskridge was probably, in that conversation as well. They've talked at length, and McDonald himself talked about how much he liked Tariq just the other day. Even though he didn't have a dynamic preseason in the games anyway that we could see, just his versatility, his physicality, his size and athletic profile, but his ability to block. We've seen in the past under the last coaching staff some versatility coming out of the backfield, some of those kinds of things. And then also how good he is on special teams and how he plays on just about all the special teams. You lose someone like John Radigan, you need to fill that void. It is not nothing. It is not an insignificant contribution. And so that's another reason why I think Michael Barrett would be a priority for them to bring back, because he is known as an outstanding special teams player. Certainly Jay Harbaugh, the special teams coordinator, knows that as well as anyone. Let's check while I'm doing this and see if there is any new news on the practice squad situation. Trying to catch up to Twitter. Let's see what we have here. Some teams have just flat out announced their entire practice squads already. The Buffalo Bills have done that. The Seahawks typically kind of are the last to announce roster cuts and all, anything that involves a deadline. The Seahawks usually come afterwards. So yeah, really nothing new as of this moment about new additions to the Seahawks practice squad. This could mean a couple of things. You know, having a couple players claimed also is evidence of this. But when you remember, back to after the first couple of years of roster churn, when Carroll got here, those early Seahawk teams, the Super Bowl Seahawk teams, they would routinely get a lot of players claimed at the cut down. That's how deep and talented their roster was. That wasn't the case as we moved forward a little bit. Things got a lot thinner and their depth was compromised. And it was one of the reasons that, things kind of took a turn downward. But I've been saying that about this roster all offseason since the draft and free agency leading into and through training camp, that I thought we were kind of in that position again. And so the fact that they're taking a little bit longer to fill out their practice squad could mean that some of the players they're trying to bring back are in demand and that they're in competition with other teams for those players. And then one player I did not mention that they have brought back on the practice squad is Artie Burns. This was a big question mark. We thought the injury Saturday night when he was carted off, the non-contact injury where he came up lame, looked a little more serious. I mean, Burns looked like he was in distress. It must be nothing, or at least to nothing, because not only has Burns been brought back to the practice squad, but according to Adam Schefter, he has been promised or told that he will be elevated to the active roster week 1. So this may have been the plan all along. We're waiting to see now if DJ James comes back, because I do think he has a lot of potential as a slot corner. We saw some really great run support on Saturday night, some physicality from him. He had a pass defense, broke up a ball early on over the middle, and then came up and made some really sure tackles in open space. So I think, learning behind a guy like Artie Burns could really be valuable. But Burns' value in and of itself, being the veteran that he is, and also making such a smooth transition to slot corner, nickel corner in the last season, but also a guy that can play outside in a pinch too, because that's his background. He must be healthy, good to go. He's another guy. The Seahawks may be in some of those kinds of negotiations with other players, or trying to convince players that were intending to sign back to the practice squad of their original team that maybe they should come out west. So as those signings become official, follow me on Twitter as always to keep up with my reaction to those. What do you guys think about the moves that have been made? Seahawks also may still, again, be looking at, for a nose tackle or a defensive tackle. But, they kept Miles Adams. Adams put some really good reps on tape. I mean, I feel like maybe this coaching staff is kind of unlocking him, even though he's flashed plenty in the last 3 years. But Adams is a guy who's, he's not that typical nose tackle build, but he's put some really good reps on tape playing inside like that, and he can play outside as well. And so I've kind of backed off the idea that they might be aggressively looking for another guy there, because I think they feel like they can get by with what they have, and that 4 or 5 weeks from now, Cameron Young comes back healthy. He's a guy that's going to be in that rotation and really contribute. So I'm really excited to see what this staff can do with Cam Young, because I do think there's something there to be like a bulldog in the middle of that line. One of the scouting reports I'll never forget, that after he was drafted was, one of the guys on NFL Network passed on that the scout told him he's like a junkyard dog, like a throwback. And I do think that we haven't even really seen that from him. He was kind of nicked up his rookie year, and now he's been hurt all preseason. So I think knowing that they have that on the horizon, they might feel like they can get by with what they have. Plus, the guys that they have are all very versatile. They can all play inside or outside, except for Hankins. So as long as he's healthy, I think they feel good about what they have. How do you feel about what they have? Also, one last note. I threw out on the last show that, hey, how many of you would want to play in a fantasy league? Maybe go as high as a 14-team league, even though I get really uncomfortable with 14-team leagues. Anything over 12 gets a little stressful. 50 of you said that you'd want to play in the league. So what I will do is basically just go back and take the first 14. and we will do it that way. But maybe I'll open up. Well, I don't want to. I got a lot on my plate, you guys. I was gonna say maybe we'll do like a Survivor League too, and that way all of you can sign up for that. Potentially, I'm not gonna promise that, but it's just an idea that came into my head, and so I passed it along to you. All the ways you can support the show linked down below in the description. Check those out. Shout out to BetUS for sponsoring this episode. And again, at Seahawks Forever on Twitter. Coming up tomorrow, Greg Bell, the Tacoma News Tribune, longtime outstanding beat writer for the Seahawks, will give us his thoughts on what's going on with the Seahawks roster, how he feels about this roster heading into the regular season opener on September 8th. Griffin Sturgeon is going to be joining me later this weekend to give his thoughts from a more X&O and technical standpoint, get some of his scouting notes on some of these young players. And then Jessamine McIntyre of KJR is going to be joining the show on Monday for her thoughts heading into week 1. Until then, forever and always, go Hawks.